The human heart is a strange thing. It carries love, guilt, and sometimes murder. On a cold, silent night, in a house filled with secrets, a decision was made. A mother stood between justice and sin, between protecting her son and stopping him. But was it truly justice? Or was it just another crime hidden beneath a mother's love? Tonight we uncover a truth so chilling, so unexpected, that even the greatest detective failed to see it coming. Dear viewers, you are about to step into a world of mystery, deception, and intellect, where every detail matters, and the line between truth and illusion blurs. Tonight on the Detective Tales channel, prepare to be enthralled by a gripping tale of Hercule Poirot, one that takes us back to his early days as a detective in Belgium. This is not just another case of brilliance and deduction, but a haunting reminder that even the greatest minds are not infallible. In a rare moment of vulnerability, Poirot himself confesses to a failure, one that left a lingering shadow on his otherwise impeccable record. This story, first published in 1923, showcases Agatha Christie's deep psychological insight into crime and the human condition, where the tiniest, most trivial details, such as the unusual color of a chocolate box, become the key to unlocking a mystery. But more than that, it is a reflection of how even the sharpest detective can overlook a hidden truth buried beneath layers of deception. It was a night unlike any other. A storm raged outside, lashing against the windows with relentless fury, while inside, the fire crackled warmly, casting flickering shadows on the walls. Poirot sat across from me, his small frame relaxed, yet his sharp eyes betrayed the ever-working mind beneath. Between us sat a modest table, on my side, a steaming glass of carefully brewed toddy, and on his a cup of thick, rich chocolate, so dark and dense that I shuddered at the mere thought of drinking it. Poirot, however, sipped it with evident delight, exhaling in deep satisfaction. "C'est la vie," he murmured, his voice thoughtful yet serene. "Life is indeed good," I agreed, leaning back into my chair. "And for you, mon ami, success is second nature. Have you ever in your illustrious career faced a case where you truly failed?" Poirot, always modest despite his accomplishments, gave a small smile. "Failure, my friend, is a cruel teacher, but a necessary one. One does not reach the heights without knowing the depths." He paused, his expression turning introspective, as if transported back in time. "But yes, once I made an error so grave, so foolish, that to this day, it remains a lesson etched in my mind." He leaned forward, his gaze locked onto mine, and in that moment, the air seemed to grow heavier, thick with unsaid truths. "Tonight," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I shall tell you of the one case where Hercule Poirot was outwitted." The wind roared like a beast outside, rattling the old wooden shutters, as if demanding entry. Inside, the fire burned low, casting flickering shadows on the walls of the dimly lit study. Detective Lucien Moreau leaned back in his chair, fingers idly tracing the rim of his porcelain coffee cup. Across from him, Inspector Delacroix sat stiffly, his sharp eyes fixed on Moreau, with barely concealed impatience. "You boast too much of your victories, Moreau," Delacroix said, his voice laced with challenge. "Tell me, have you ever been truly outwitted?" Moreau chuckled softly, his fingers pausing their movement. "Ah, my friend, you wound me. But yes, there was one case, a case that still haunts me to this day." He paused, swirling his coffee absent-mindedly. "It was a winter in Lyon, many years ago. A man of great influence, Henri Valiant, was found dead in his grand estate, seated at his desk as though in deep contemplation. No struggle, no sign of forced entry. The doctor ruled it a heart attack. Case closed." Delacroix frowned. But Moreau's gaze darkened, the flickering fire reflecting in his eyes. "But the air in that room, it was wrong. A faint trace of something sweet lingered, not perfume, not tobacco, something artificial." He took a slow sip of his coffee. "You see, my friend, the devil is in the details." He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Valiant's private secretary, a quiet woman named Elise Martin, delivered his nightly brandy, and a single piece of chocolate, a ritual he never missed." Moreau exhaled. "A simple indulgence, a harmless treat. And yet the chocolate was the key." Delacroix leaned in. "Poison?" Moreau nodded. a slow, nearly undetectable toxin, a clever crime, committed without a trace, except for that lingering sickly sweetness in the air. And here is where I failed, my dear friend. He set his cup down with a soft clink. Elise Martin vanished that very night. No trace, no witnesses, a ghost slipping through my fingers, and to this day, I have never found her. The fire crackled between them, as silence settled like a heavy shroud. Moreau sighed, shaking his head. Even the greatest hunters sometimes lose their prey. The night was heavy with rain, each drop lashing against the tall windows of the estate, like an impatient hand demanding entry. The grand house, draped in mourning, stood eerily silent, except for the occasional creak of wood contracting in the cold. Inspector Etienne Marceau adjusted his hat as he stepped inside, his eyes flickering over the dimly lit hall. He was not here by official orders, nor did he have the luxury of a proper investigation, only the desperate plea of a young woman who believed, against all common sense, that the esteemed Monsieur Armand Beliveau had not died a natural death. The girl Camille Durand stood near the fireplace, her face pale but determined. "You must listen to me, Inspector," she whispered urgently. "Something is terribly wrong." Marceau arched an eyebrow. "Doctors say it was heart failure, mademoiselle." "And they are wrong," she snapped, her voice trembling. "He was strong, full of life, and now he is gone, just like that. You think that is normal?" Marceau studied her carefully. Desperation could lead to wild theories, but there was something in her eyes, a certainty that troubled him. "Who was in the house that night?" he asked. Camille inhaled sharply. "His housekeeper, Madame Rocher, his valet Etienne Leclerc, and two guests, Monsieur Renaud Vaudin, an old friend, and Miss Eleanor Whitmore, an Englishwoman of some acquaintance." Marceau frowned. A small gathering, no suspicious figures among them. Camille hesitated, then spoke with quiet intensity. "Inspector, I am not a fool. I know when something feels wrong." That night, he received a letter, one that disturbed him greatly. He burned it in the fireplace, but I saw the fear in his face. And then, mere hours later, he was dead. Marceau felt a prickle of unease. "Did anyone else see this letter?" "No," she admitted, "but I saw something else. In his study after he had passed, the candle on his desk had melted into an unusual shape. Someone had been there, waiting." The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken thoughts. A death too convenient, a letter turned to ash, a single candle burned beyond its time. Marceau exhaled, his instincts awakening. "Mademoiselle, if what you say is true, then this is no ordinary death, and I will need more than just suspicion to uncover the truth." The storm outside howled against the grand estate, rattling its ancient windows as Inspector Gabriel Laurent stood in the dimly lit study, his keen eyes sweeping over every detail. He was here on the desperate insistence of Madame Renard, who refused to believe that her husband, the esteemed politician Etienne Renard, had died of natural causes. Poison, she had whispered the word with such certainty that Laurent had felt the weight of it settle in his chest. Now, with no tangible evidence, and only suspicion to guide him, he retraced the evening's events with meticulous precision. Dinner had been a simple affair, a creamy soup ladled directly by Monsieur Renard himself, a plate of roasted lamb, a side of sautéed vegetables, and a bowl of ripe pears that gleamed under the chandelier's glow. The coffee, rich and steaming, had been served in a large silver pot, poured generously into cups by the valet. Marceau, at first glance, indicated foul play. The guests that night, Madame Renard, her cousin Lucien Duval, the family doctor Dr. Moreau, and a visiting Englishman, Mr. Harold Graves, had all dined together, their laughter drifting through the halls. But it was in the study, barely an hour later, that Renard had collapsed without warning, his face darkening, his breath seizing, his body convulsing before it fell eerily still. Laurent sighed, his fingers drumming against the polished oak desk. The doctor had declared it a heart failure, a tragic but explainable end. Yet something gnawed at Laurent's instincts. He examined the heavy leather chair, where Renard had spent his final moments, running his fingers along its edges, searching for any unseen punctures, perhaps a hidden hypodermic needle. Nothing. He checked the inkwell, the glasses, the fireplace, anything that might hold a clue. Still nothing. Frustration clawed at him. Was this truly a wild fantasy born of grief? But then just as he turned, something caught his eye, a small ornate box resting near the window, a box of chocolates. He stepped closer, lifting the lid. It was full, untouched, every chocolate pristine in its place. And yet something was wrong. The box had been unsealed, its ribbon carefully snipped, but no one had taken even a single piece. Why? A cold shiver ran down his spine. This was not an oversight. This was not normal. Somewhere in this house, a murderer walked free, and this box was the first crack in their perfect crime. Inspector Gabriel Laurent's sharp gaze fell upon the ornate chocolate box, resting on the polished mahogany table. At first glance, it was unremarkable, a delicate, luxurious confectionery case, wrapped with an elegant ribbon, but something about it gnawed at him. The box itself was a deep burgundy, yet the lid was an odd shade of ivory, a subtle detail, but one that set his instincts aflame. Boxes of chocolates were often adorned with contrasting ribbons, but mismatched lids and bases, that was rare, deliberate, a mistake or a message. His fingers traced the edges of the box, as he turned to the butler, Marcel. "Tell me, did Monsieur Renard enjoy sweets?" Marcel hesitated for a fraction of a second before nodding solemnly. "Passionately, Inspector. He always kept chocolates on hand. He never drank wine, you see. Sweets were his only indulgence." Laurent lifted the lid, revealing a pristine array of untouched chocolates. "And yet this box has not been opened." Marcel's brows furrowed. "No, sir, that was a new box, purchased the very day he died. The old one was nearly empty." "Empty," Laurent repeated, the pieces clicking into place. "Then the previous box was finished on the day of his death." "Yes, Inspector. I found it empty the next morning and disposed of it." A slow, knowing smile spread across Laurent's face. "Can you retrieve it for me?" Marcel looked startled but nodded. "I believe it's in the kitchen refuse bin. I'll fetch it." A few minutes later he returned, dusting off the discarded box. Laurent's pulse quickened as he turned it over in his hands. It was an exact replica, except for one glaring anomaly. This time the box was ivory, and the lid was burgundy, an almost imperceptible detail, but to Laurent, it screamed of intent, a deliberate switch. "Marcel," he said, his voice measured, "I need your utmost discretion. Tell no one of this." The butler gave a firm nod. Laurent wasted no time. His next stop was Dr. Moreau, the physician who had declared Renard's death as natural. The doctor, a wiry man with keen probing eyes, regarded Laurent warily as he posed his questions. "Inspector, there are countless instances where a man seemingly healthy collapses without warning. A sudden rush of blood to the head, an aneurysm triggered by anger or excitement. It happens." "Anger?" Laurent pressed. Had Renard been in a state of distress? The doctor hesitated before answering. He had been arguing heatedly with Monsieur Lucien Duval that evening. "Religion, Inspector, a deeply personal and often volatile subject between them. Renard, a staunch secularist, and Duval, an unwavering Catholic. Their debates had grown increasingly hostile over the weeks. Some say Renard considered Duval a fanatic." A new layer of intrigue unfolded before Laurent. Could this disagreement have escalated into something more sinister? He leaned in, lowering his voice. "Tell me, doctor, would it be possible to introduce a fatal dose of poison into a box of chocolates?" Moreau's expression flickered, just for a moment, but Laurent caught it. A slow-acting toxin, perhaps, one that wouldn't cause immediate suspicion. The doctor exhaled slowly, steepling his fingers. "Theoretically, yes, a carefully measured dose could mask itself as an unexpected heart failure, especially if the victim was predisposed to cardiovascular issues. But such a poison would have to be meticulously administered, and from what I understand, Renard ate those chocolates regularly." "Which means," Laurent murmured, his mind racing, "the fatal piece must have been strategically placed, ensuring he would consume it on that very night." The discarded box in his hands suddenly felt heavier. Somewhere in this tangled web of arguments, misplaced loyalties, and hidden tensions, a killer lurked, and Laurent was closing in. Detective Adrian Blackthorne had always trusted his instincts. They were the sharpest tools in his arsenal, honed over years of unraveling the darkest mysteries. That morning, As he stepped into the dimly lit study of the late Magnus Vallier, a familiar unease crawled up his spine. The study was immaculately kept, as if frozen in time. Heavy velvet curtains filtered the morning light, casting long shadows over the room. The scent of aged paper, polished wood, and something faintly sweet lingered in the air. His eyes swept the grand oak desk, where a single object stood out, a mahogany box, its surface gleaming under the weak sunlight. It was positioned with almost deliberate care, as if left untouched after being placed there. But what caught Adrian's attention wasn't its presence, it was its peculiarity. The base of the box was a deep red, but its lid was emerald green, a mismatched combination, a detail seemingly insignificant to an untrained eye, but Adrian had solved far too many cases to dismiss such oddities. His fingers brushed against the box's cool surface before he lifted the lid. Inside, a row of untouched chocolates lay neatly arranged, each piece identical in shape and color. Something about them felt staged, too pristine, too deliberate. His mind clicked into place. A man like Magnus Vallier, known for his love of chocolates, wouldn't have left them untouched, unless he hadn't gotten the chance. He turned sharply. "Pierre," he called, his voice firm yet measured. The butler, a wiry man with a stiff posture and hollow eyes, appeared almost instantly, his footsteps barely making a sound on the thick carpet. "Yes, monsieur." "Did Mr. Vallier have a preference for chocolates?" Adrian inquired, tapping the edge of the box. Pierre hesitated. A flicker of something sadness, perhaps even apprehension, crossed his face. "Monsieur adored them, always had a box in his study. He never drank, you see. Sweets were his indulgence." Adrian's gaze narrowed. "Yet these remain untouched." Pierre's throat bobbed as he swallowed. That was a new box, bought just hours before his passing. The previous one was nearly finished. A pulse of realization thrummed through Adrian. He leaned forward. "And that empty box, where is it now?" Pierre's brow furrowed in thought before his eyes widened. "In the waste bin, I suppose." "Fetch it." The butler disappeared into the adjoining hallway, returning moments later with a dust-laden container. Adrian took it carefully, his fingers tracing the edges. Then his pulse quickened. The base of this box was emerald green, the lid, deep red, the opposite of the box on the desk. Two identical boxes, their lids swapped, a deliberate act. And then the question that changed everything. Where was the old box before it was discarded? Pierre's expression darkened. On his desk, like always, which meant someone had been in this study, someone who needed to make the switch. The implications sent a chill down Adrian's spine. Without another word, he left the house, his mind whirling. His next destination was the office of Dr. Leroux, the physician who had examined the body. Dr. Leroux, a man of precision and caution, welcomed him into a space filled with the sterile scent of antiseptic. "Detective Blackthorne," he greeted, folding his hands together. "To what do I owe this visit?" "Vallier's cause of death," Adrian said, wasting no time. "You ruled it heart failure." Dr. Leroux gave a slow nod. "Yes, a sudden collapse after dinner, no signs of struggle, no external injuries. Heart failure is not uncommon at his age. And yet," Adrian leaned in, watching the doctor's face carefully. "Is it possible he was poisoned?" "Yes, possible he was poisoned." A flicker of unease passed through the physician's eyes. He hesitated before replying, choosing his words with care. "Possible, but no overt signs. If it was a delayed-acting toxin, it would be difficult to trace without a thorough toxicology report. And if it were laced in something he consumed daily." Dr. Laurent's gaze sharpened. "You're suggesting chocolate?" The doctor inhaled sharply. "If he consumed it regularly, and if someone tampered with it, the poison could have accumulated in his system without immediate suspicion. But what kind of poison would be slow, subtle, and deadly enough?" Adrian's thoughts were already racing. He had a lead to chase. His next stop was the apothecary near Vallier's residence. He entered the shop, the scent of dried herbs and chemicals thick in the air. A few discreet questions, a flash of authority, and soon he had what he needed. A young assistant behind the counter remembered a purchase made not long ago. "It was a prescription, monsieur," the assistant recalled. "A mild cardiac medication. Chocolate-coated tablets." Adrian's pulse quickened. "Who purchased it?" The assistant furrowed his brows. A gentleman named John Weston. Adrian's stomach turned. John Weston, a name that had appeared in the investigation before. A business associate, a friend of Vellier, the very man who had suggested the medication in the first place. The realization crashed down on him like a tidal wave. The medication itself was harmless in moderation, but if someone manipulated the dosage, ensuring Vellier consumed far more than prescribed, it would be fatal. The method was brilliant in its simplicity. A trusted indulgence laced with death, the switch of lids to mask the evidence, and the perfect suspect, a man with everything to gain from Vellier's demise. Adrian turned on his heel, already strategizing his next move. The pieces were falling into place. The chase was on. Detective Adrian Blackthorne had encountered devious schemes before, but this case, this tangled web of deception, was something else entirely. The circumstances surrounding the death of Magnus Vellier were far too precise to be mere coincidence. A man who had suffered from angina for years, Vellier had been found dead in his study, slumped over his desk, his face frozen in an expression of quiet shock. At first glance, it seemed natural. His heart had given out, but something about the scene felt meticulously crafted, as though death had been invited in, not by chance, but by design. The mahogany chocolate box on the desk was a detail too striking to ignore. The lid, slightly askew, revealed a neatly arranged row of chocolates, perfect, untouched, save for the one that Vellier had presumably consumed before his final breath. That single piece of confectionery, however, was more than just a sweet indulgence. It had become the very instrument of his demise. Adrian studied the box closely, his keen gaze narrowing. Someone had tampered with it. He could see it, feel it, the faintest disturbance in the way the chocolates were arranged, the subtle inconsistency in their placement. Whoever had done this had taken great care to make it appear as though nothing had been disturbed, but Adrian was not so easily deceived. Vellier's death had been swift, silent. A fatal dose of trinitrin, a medication meant to regulate his failing heart, had instead been weaponized against him. But how had it been administered? The answer lay in the chocolates themselves. Someone had mistakenly opened the wrong box for the full one, before realizing their error, and swapping it with the nearly empty one. That was when the deception truly began. They had taken the last remaining chocolate, and carefully hollowed it out, replacing its contents with as many tiny trinitrin tablets as it would hold. Given the size of the chocolates, Adrian estimated that between 20 and 30 tablets could have been crammed inside, more than enough to send Vellier into cardiac arrest the moment he took a bite. But who had done it? There were 2 guests in the house that night, each with their own connection to the victim. John Weston, a close acquaintance, had the means to access the medication, but it was Father St. Allard, the pious and reserved priest, who had the most compelling. Adrian had encountered men like him before, fanatics who viewed themselves as instruments of divine will. There was no zealot more dangerous than one who believed his actions were justified in the eyes of God. But if St. Allard had indeed orchestrated this crime, how had he acquired the necessary poison? Trinitrin was not something one could simply stumble upon. Then an idea struck Adrian, small, almost inconsequential, but significant in the grander scheme of the mystery. Why had John Weston run out of his own heart medication? A man as meticulous as Weston would have surely ensured he had an adequate supply before traveling. The missing pills were an anomaly, one that demanded closer scrutiny. Returning to the house on Avenue Louise, Adrian sought out Felice, the maid responsible for tending to the rooms. She was quick to answer his questions, her frustration evident as she recounted how Weston had misplaced a bottle of his medication days earlier. The blame had fallen upon her, though she swore she had never touched it. She was certain that Jeanette, another servant known for prying where she didn't belong, had been the true culprit. Adrian listened carefully, his mind assembling the pieces of the puzzle. If Jeanette had taken the bottle, it was highly unlikely she had done so of her own accord. Someone had manipulated her into stealing it, someone who had a plan, and now, Adrian was certain he knew who. Knowing, however, was not the same as proving. It was a lesson Adrian had learned time and time again. The case reminded him of Styles, where he had all the answers but lacked the final irrefutable link needed to bring the truth to light. He needed more than mere suspicions. He needed evidence that would hold up against scrutiny. The path ahead was clear. He had to confront St. Allard, force him into a corner, and extract the confession that would unravel the entire scheme. But St. Allard was no ordinary suspect. He was a man who believed he was acting on behalf of a higher power, and nothing was more unpredictable than a killer who thought his actions were righteous. Adrian knew one thing for certain: this was no longer just a case of murder. It was a battle between reason and belief, between truth and conviction, and in this dangerous game, only one would emerge victorious. Detective Adrian Duval had spent years unraveling the darkest mysteries of Brussels, but this case had a weight to it, an eerie silence that whispered of something far more sinister than an ordinary crime. Magnus Vallier had been found dead in his study, a man with a long history of heart trouble. At first glance, his death seemed tragically inevitable, just another victim claimed by a frail heart. But the details were too deliberate, too carefully constructed. The half-opened chocolate box on his desk, the untouched wine glass beside it, and the peculiar way his body had slumped forward as if in quiet surrender, these were not the signs of a man who had merely succumbed to fate. No, this was murder, a slow, calculated execution designed to pass unnoticed. Adrian studied the box, his sharp mind sifting through the deception. The chocolates appeared pristine, yet he knew better. A single bite could hold death within its delicate shell, and sure enough, one piece had been altered, hollowed out and refilled, not with sweet ganache, but with lethal doses of trinitrin. A cruel irony: the very medicine meant to save Vallier's failing heart had been used to end his life. But who had the means to orchestrate such a scheme, and more importantly, who had the will? There were two guests in the house that night, both with secrets of their own. John Weston, a longtime friend, had access to the very medication that had sealed Vallier's fate, but Adrian's instincts pulled him toward another suspect, the enigmatic and devout Father St. Allard. There was something unsettling in the way the priest had spoken of Vallier in hushed tones, the way his eyes had darkened ever so slightly at the mention of the deceased man's fortune. Could a man of faith be capable of such a carefully executed crime? As Adrian delved deeper, a missing bottle of medication led him to the household staff. The maid Felice recalled an incident, a misplaced vial of heart medicine that had vanished days before, a minor event at the time, but now it reeked of premeditation. Jeanette, another servant, had been seen handling it, but Adrian doubted she had acted alone. Someone had manipulated her, someone who needed access to those pills without suspicion, and that someone was growing desperate. A cryptic note arrived late that night, its words a plea wrapped in quiet menace: "Leave it be. There is no mystery to solve." But Adrian was no ordinary investigator. The hunt for truth was in his blood, and once he caught a scent, nothing on earth could make him abandon it. The note only confirmed what he already knew: he was close, too close. He secured an address, one that led him to the secluded estate of Father St. Allard, but gaining entry was another matter entirely. A man like St. Allard would not welcome a detective at his door, not without good reason. And so Adrian became something else, a plumber with a fabricated emergency. It was a simple deception, but an effective one. Under the guise of repairing a supposed gas leak, he slipped into the house, his real mission concealed beneath the weight of his tool bag. What was he searching for? He wasn't sure. Proof, perhaps. A sign that his suspicions were not mere conjecture. And then, in the dim light of the priest's private chambers, he found it, a locked cupboard above the washstand. A simple lock, easy to pick. Inside, amongst old bottles and forgotten relics, lay the one thing he needed: a small glass vial, its label bearing an English chemist's mark, trinitrin tablets, one to be taken when required, the name on the bottle John Weston. Adrian's hands trembled slightly as he slipped the vial into his pocket. This was it, the final thread in the web of deception. St. Allard had orchestrated the theft, used Weston's medicine to lace the chocolate, and ensured Vallier's death looked like a tragic accident, the perfect crime, until now. By morning Adrian was back in Brussels, his report half written when another note arrived. This time, There was no warning, no veiled plea, just urgency. It was from Madame Darreau, summoning him to the house on Avenue Louise. The game was nearly over, but Adrian knew one thing: when cornered, a desperate man could be far more dangerous than a guilty one. The room was dimly lit, the golden glow of candlelight casting eerie shadows against the heavy velvet drapes. The silence in the chamber was suffocating, thick with the weight of unsaid words and unsolved mysteries. I had been summoned, led through the winding corridors of this ancient estate by Le Baron, the ever-watchful butler, whose expression remained unreadable. He paused before a set of grand doors, their dark mahogany surface carved with intricate patterns, stories of power, legacy, and perhaps hidden sins. With a quiet nod, Le Baron pushed the doors open, revealing the room beyond, and there she was. Lady Beauchamp sat in an imposing armchair, her frail frame swallowed by the grandeur of her surroundings. She wore a gown of deep violet, the kind that spoke of old wealth and mourning. Her silver hair was arranged neatly, but it was her eyes, dark, piercing, filled with a knowledge I was yet to grasp, that unsettled me. There was no sign of Miss Vinnie. She observed me in silence, her fingers lightly drumming against the carved wooden arms of her chair. Then, with a calmness that sent a chill down my spine, she finally spoke. "You are not what you pretend to be, are you?" Her voice was quiet, yet it carried across the room with an authority that commanded attention. I said nothing. Her lips curled into the faintest trace of a smile, one that held no warmth. "A detective," she continued, her tone laced with something unreadable. "You have come to uncover the truth about my son's death." I gave her a slow nod, measuring her reaction. "Then tell me." She leaned forward slightly, her voice almost a whisper. "How far have you come in your search?" I hesitated, the weight of my findings pressing against my chest. Every clue, every whispered warning, every locked drawer I had forced open in pursuit of the truth, it had all led me here. And now, standing before her, I felt an inexplicable unease. "I have uncovered everything," I admitted finally. "Your son was murdered, and I know by whom." A flicker of something, satisfaction, resignation crossed her face, but it was gone before I could place it. "Go on," she urged, her tone steady, unwavering, and so I did. I recounted every step of the investigation, the letters I had found, the hidden correspondence detailing financial fraud, the testimonies of those who had once feared to speak, the locked cabinet in her son's study, which had concealed a will that was never meant to be found, the servant who had seen something in the dead of night, but had been too terrified to reveal it, the cryptic message scrawled in the margins of an old ledger, a desperate plea hidden in plain sight. When I finished, the silence that followed was heavier than before. She simply exhaled, the sound barely audible. "You are mistaken," she said quietly. I stiffened. "Mistaken? The killer you seek is not who you believe." The certainty in her voice unsettled me. I had built this case piece by piece, each clue fitting together in an unbreakable chain of logic, and yet there was no doubt in her expression. "Then who?" I demanded. A long pause stretched between us. Her gaze did not waver, her fingers now motionless against the wood of her chair, and then, in a voice devoid of hesitation, she uttered the unthinkable. "It was I." The confession struck like a thunderclap. For the first time since stepping into this house, I felt the ground beneath me shift, my pulse quickened, my breath caught somewhere between shock and disbelief. I searched her face, expecting some sign of deception, but there was none. "My son was a monster," she continued, her voice hollow now, stripped of all pretense. "He destroyed lives, he ruined families, he manipulated, lied, and took what he pleased without fear of consequence, but that was not his worst sin." The room seemed to darken around us as she continued. "He murdered his wife." The words were spoken not in accusation, but in finality. "He thought no one saw," she murmured, her gaze unfocused, lost in some distant memory. "But I did. I barely found my voice." "You saw it happen." She nodded, her fingers tightening slightly around the armrests. As I stepped out of my room that morning, I saw her standing at the top of the grand staircase. She was holding a letter, one she was never meant to read. I saw my son approach her from behind, moving with the quiet precision of a predator, and then, one swift push. My stomach turned. "I remember the sound," she whispered, closing her eyes briefly. The way her body struck the marble steps, the way the silence after was so much louder than the scream that never came. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my breath. "When they found her," she continued, "he wept. He played the grieving husband to perfection. And I," her voice faltered for the first time, "I kept silent." She let out a quiet, bitter laugh. "For years I bore the weight of that silence. But silence makes one an accomplice, does it not?" Her gaze locked onto mine, and I felt the question burrow into me like a blade. So I did what had to be done. A long pause stretched between us. The candle light flickered, casting shifting shadows across the room. I finally spoke, my voice barely above a whisper. "How?" Her eyes, tired and ancient, bore into mine. "Does it matter?" she asked simply. I had spent my life chasing justice, but now standing in front of this woman, this mother who had taken justice into her own hands, I was no longer certain if I had found it, or if I had lost myself in the very shadows I had sworn to chase away. A heavy stillness settled in the room, and for the first time I did not know what to do with the truth. The candle light flickered unevenly, its weak glow casting monstrous shadows against the high walls of the chamber. The room smelled of time itself, of aged paper, of perfumes long faded but not yet forgotten, of secrets sealed away behind dust-laden curtains. The grand tapestries along the walls seemed to shudder with every gust of wind that rattled the stained glass windows. It was as if the house itself knew the weight of the confession about to unfold. Madame Alara Voss sat across from me in her vast gilded chair. Age had stolen much from her, but not her composure. She remained upright, regal even, her pale fingers resting delicately on the armrest, though I could see the faint tremor in them. Her face, carved with time and sorrow, bore the remnants of a beauty that had once commanded admiration, now replaced by an eerie dignity. Her eyes, two dim embers in the fading light, studied me, not with fear, but with an understanding far older than the moment we shared. She had summoned me here, knowing she had little time left, knowing that what she carried within her was too heavy to take to the grave. And so I sat before her, waiting. The silence between us was thick, stretching unbearably until she finally broke it with a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of years. "You see, monsieur," she began, her voice low and deliberate, "there are sins a mother can endure, and there are sins she must erase." I remained silent. I had learned long ago that in moments like this, words were unnecessary. It was the pauses, the breaths, the unspoken truths that mattered. She exhaled slowly, eyes fluttering closed for a moment before she continued. "He was my son, and yet he was not. I had seen it in him when he was a boy. The way he played, the way he smiled. He did not feel as others did. I had told myself it was just a phase, a lack of guidance, but deep down, I knew. A mother always knows." The fire in the hearth crackled, throwing shifting patterns across her face, illuminating the ghost of a past she was now ready to unearth. "He had a way with women," she continued, her voice now sharper, laced with something between grief and contempt. "He fascinated them, trapped them in his web without them even realizing it. Viridia, poor child, was no different. She was innocent, too young, too trusting, too blind to see the darkness she was walking into. She admired him, worshipped him, loved him, and he knew it. That was his gift, his curse. He could take a woman's devotion and twist it into a weapon." Her fingers tightened over the armrest, her knuckles whitening. "I had seen it happen before," she murmured, her gaze slipping past me, lost in the corridors of memory. Another girl, another promise whispered in the dark, another soul shattered beyond repair. But Viridia, no, I could not let her be next. He had already stolen a life before. He had already painted his hands in the invisible ink of blood. I could not, would not, allow it again. She paused, breathing in deeply as if to steady herself. I could hear the firewood shift in the hearth, a subtle pop breaking the stillness of the room. She continued, her voice now a whisper of steel. "So I did what only a mother could do," she said, her lips barely moving. "I walked into his study, where the grand box of chocolates always stood, filled with indulgence he never denied himself, and there with hands steady and heart unyielding, I placed death among the sweetness." She let the words settle in the air before continuing. "Just one, the the last of an old batch. The others, untouched, would be left in their pristine new box, the way he preferred. No one else would eat from it, but him. No one else would die from it but him. The realization struck me like a sharp gust of wind, yet I said nothing. Her confession was not yet complete. And the empty bottle? I asked, my voice quieter than before, though I already knew the answer. For the first time that evening, she smiled, a slow, tired curve of the lips that held neither pride nor regret. I slipped it into his pocket when he came to bid me farewell. I did not think. I only acted. A mother's instinct, perhaps, to remove the evidence from where it would condemn me, yet in doing so I unknowingly wove suspicion around him instead. She let out a soft, almost humorless chuckle before shaking her head. You must understand, monsieur, I am an old woman. I did not plan it with the precision of a murderer. I simply did what I had to do. Her fingers trembled now, but her voice remained resolute. I did not fear judgment in this world, only in the next. And now you stand before me, the keeper of my final truth. Will you deliver me to their justice, or will you let me face the only one that matters? The candle's flame guttered, and in that moment, I saw her not as a criminal, not as a noble woman, but as something else entirely, a force beyond morality, beyond the law. She had been judge, jury, and executioner, and yet as I looked into those tired eyes, I realized she was not asking for forgiveness. She did not need it. I stood slowly, tipping my hat. Madame, I said, my voice barely above the hush of the wind outside, I have conducted my investigation, and failed. The case is closed. Her eyes, those ancient sorrowful sentinels, met mine one last time, and as I turned to leave, the clock in the hall struck its solemn chime. The final confession had been given, and the past would remain buried in its silken grave. The candle flickered, barely illuminating the grand yet decayed chamber. Dust floated lazily in the still air, settling on the heavy velvet curtains that seemed to absorb all sound. The antique grandfather clock in the corner ticked with an almost sinister patience, marking the passage of time with cruel indifference. Madame Celeste Beaumont sat before me, her frail form draped in a silk shawl that once must have gleamed with opulence. Now, like her, it was faded, a relic of a time long past. Her fingers, adorned with rings dulled by age, trembled slightly as she reached for the glass of cognac before her, though she did not drink. Instead, she exhaled a long breath, steadying herself for what she was about to confess. You see, monsieur, she murmured, her voice lined with both steel and sorrow, guilt is a strange thing. It does not weigh on all men equally. Some carry it lightly, like a feather resting upon the soul, while others are crushed beneath its unbearable weight. I have carried mine for 20 years, and yet only tonight do I set it down before you. I remained silent, letting her words sink into the cold walls around us. A confession was like an unraveling thread. You never interrupted lest the whole tapestry of truth become tangled once more. She glanced toward the fireplace, where the flames cast flickering shadows that seemed to dance with the ghosts of her past. It was my son, Lucien, she said finally, her gaze distant. I always knew there was something different about him. Even as a child, he possessed a strange charm, a dangerous allure. Women fell into his orbit as if pulled by some unseen force, and he used that power without mercy. I had watched him weave his cruel games before, but Viridia, she was different. She was young, naive, and completely in love with him. She thought she could change him, that love would soften whatever darkness lurked within him. But love does not tame a predator, it only makes the prey more vulnerable. A bitter smile touched her lips, but it did not reach her eyes. I warned him, she continued, her fingers tightening over the glass. I told him to leave her be, but he laughed as he always did, as if life itself was nothing more than an amusement. He promised her marriage. He whispered sweet lies into her ear, and then when she had given him everything, her heart, her trust, her very soul, he discarded her as if she were nothing more than a broken doll. Her eyes darkened, and for the first time, I saw the storm of emotions she had buried for so long. She took her own life, she whispered, in that very room just beyond that door. A single vial of poison, a letter addressed to Lucien, that he never even bothered to read. The air in the chamber grew heavier, the fire crackling like distant gunfire in the silence. I watched as he continued his life unbothered, unrepentant. I saw the world praise him, admire him, while beneath his charm, he was nothing more than a hollow man. And so I made my decision. Her gaze met mine, unwavering. "Poison is an elegant weapon," she murmured. "It requires no violence, no force, only patience. And patience, monsieur, is a virtue I possess in abundance." I felt my pulse quicken, but I remained outwardly calm. "You poisoned him?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. She inclined her head slightly. "A single drop in his nightly brandy," she said almost absently. I watched as he drank, as his laughter faltered, as realization dawned in his eyes, and then, as he collapsed, I placed the empty bottle in his pocket. Let them think it was his own doing. Let the world believe he had succumbed to his own sins. It was poetic, no? The clock struck midnight, its chime echoing through the room like a final toll of judgment. I studied her, this woman who had committed murder not in rage, but in cold, measured certainty. There was no remorse in her eyes, no plea for forgiveness, only a quiet satisfaction. "And now," she said softly, "you know the truth. Tell me, monsieur, what will you do with it?" I rose slowly, adjusting my coat. "Madame," I said, my voice steady, "justice has already been served. There is no need to disturb the past." A slow, knowing smile crossed her lips. "You are wise, monsieur," she whispered, "and merciful." As I stepped into the night, the air was crisp, the stars indifferent to the secrets they watched over. The truth would remain where it belonged, buried within the walls of that grand decaying house. The past had already taken its price. There was nothing left to claim.